The latest election results as we barrel towards the midterms, barriers to veterans' benefits, immigration enforcement in several states, access to home loans, and social media fees. Welcome to the States, powered by the Center Square. It's Wednesday, June 17th, 2026. I'm your host, Greg Bishop. Businessman Rick Jackson, he pumped millions of his own money into his campaign. He easily defeated Georgia Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones to win Georgia's Republican gubernatorial primary runoff, despite Jones having previously received President Donald Trump's endorsement. Kim Jarrett reports Jackson will go on to face Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms in November, who defeated 7 candidates to win her primary without the need for a runoff. Georgia Republican U.S. Representative Mike Collins defeated Derek Dooley in the U.S. Senate primary in Georgia. Collins received a last-minute endorsement from the president days before yesterday's primary. Collins will face Democratic incumbent U.S. Senator Jon Ossoff in November. 2 other statewide races in Georgia have also been decided. State Representative Tim Fleming defeated former State Representative Vernon Jones to win the Republican nomination for Secretary of State. Fleming will face Penny Brown Reynolds, winner over Dana Barrett in the Democratic primary. Elsewhere throughout the country, Alabama Republican U.S. Representative Barry Moore projected to become the Republican nominee for U.S. Senate out of Alabama, setting him up to succeed retiring Tommy Tuberville in a historic conservative seat. Moore will face attorney Everett West, the projected winner in the Democratic runoff, on November 3rd in a race to determine who will become Alabama's new U.S. Senator. Now, Tuesday's runoffs conclude a long primary process beginning with a pool of 10 candidates and ending with runoff access to secure nominations in both of those parties. Now, the race for Alabama Senate in November will play a part in the battle for control over the U.S. Senate, with Republicans counting on keeping Tuberville's seat red while they define their slim majority in that chamber. And elsewhere, Oklahoma Republican U.S. Representative Kevin Hern is projected to win the Republican nomination for Oklahoma's U.S. Senate seat in an effort to succeed recently installed Homeland Security Chief Markwayne Mullin. Hern's opponent in the general election November 3rd will be determined in a Democratic runoff that's scheduled later this summer. The midterm election season is shaping up as a tight contest, with both parties vying for control of Congress in the middle of the second Trump term. Republicans are seeking to defend their majorities in both the U.S. Senate and the House. Democrats, on the other hand, see the midterms as their chance to take back control of Congress and set the terms for the rest of Trump's presidency. Now, the next primary day coming up this coming Tuesday, and that'll be in Maryland, New York, and Utah. Be sure to get updates in your inbox with the newsletter free at thecentersquare.com. Veterans nationwide face a complex web of benefits that they have to navigate and access if they meet certain eligibility criteria. Now, some have more access to the $320 billion annually than others. A recent military.com report found roughly 300,000 veterans may be unable to access certain benefits because the conflicts they served in were neither officially designated at a period of war under federal law. One period in question here is the Central American Wars between 1982 and 1992. Joining us to discuss this and more about what can be done by states is Benjamin Krause, a disabled U.S. Air Force veteran, also a VA-accredited attorney and founder of DisabledVeterans.org. Thanks for taking time with us, Benjamin. Before we get into what can be done at the state level to help veterans get access to benefits or provide even more benefits, give us an overview of all of the different tiers that there are for benefits that veterans have access to.
All right. Well, there's a lot, so I don't want to cut anything out. I would say that when people think about veteran benefits, and thanks for having me on, basically what veterans usually are thinking of in the public are really referring to what's called disability compensation is the biggest. That's the biggest ticket item for the most part. You also have healthcare. And then aside from that, you have the GI Bill, you have the VA home loan, you have VA pension, which is partly what we're talking about here with respect to the Central American Wars and recognizing those veterans for what they had done there. And there's a bunch of others related to training, related to unique elements of healthcare, related to other components of compensation. So I want to say there's definitely well over 10 different types of benefits when it comes to the VA and some of the sub components of that. So
And all of
that's
these being
benefits for all
extremely
of them.
important, but there are gaps that exist here.
Mhm.
Explain some of those gaps in eligibility and how some may have more access than others.
Sure. For the purpose of the Central American War, individuals, it's important to recognize that that was not an official war by Congress, right? So Congress did not declare that as a war, which is different than what we currently have, which is the war in the Middle East, or the Persian War. And that is still essentially ongoing and has been since about the 90s. So it's been ongoing. Whereas in this instance, it was, I guess somebody might call it even like a carve out, where while the soldiers were sent there and were fighting in combat in certain ways, it wasn't publicly recognized. And I think there's a lot of reasons why it wasn't publicly recognized, in part because I think we're aware of like the Iran-Contra issue and certain other activities that our government was engaged in, where maybe some of those battles or conflicts weren't something that maybe our country was admitting was going on at that point in time. And so a parallel example of that would be how our country hasn't fully acknowledged where we have shipped what is commonly called Agent Orange throughout Southeast Asia. And there's a lot of controversy about that because veterans that touched it in different theaters may develop cancer and other maladies. And so our country doesn't fully admit, everywhere that it's been, including, I think, Japan was one of the examples, certain parts of Korea, Guam, where it has been, is not fully acknowledged, I think, by our government yet. And so there's a lot of reasons why that might be. When it comes to veterans in the Central American Wars, I don't think anyone doubts that or disputes that there was a conflict there and it was a big deal. But our country hasn't really embraced or acknowledged what those service members did. So when you're, I think the context here is important. You have somebody that might be serving new, 18 years old, 20 years old, maybe 24 years old, serving in a combat capacity, not realizing, the long-term effect that they're serving in a way that isn't recognized by Congress. And so if there is an issue later, they may not get the full access to healthcare, for example. VA pension is one that's important, but not fully, flushed out by the public, really. And so in this context, the veterans are talking a lot about not only the lack of recognition publicly. So in other words, they're not getting certain medals or other benefits that they might get. So let's say that you are in combat in a theater in a way. If you're serving in Iraq and you get hurt, and it's something that you can only document by your personal statement because there is no medical evidence of that. For a combat veteran in that context, your personal statement may be enough to get that compensation benefit. Whereas for the people in these other wars, if it's not recognized as combat, but instead training, it's not going to carry, that statement may not carry the same weight of law as somebody that served in a different theater, maybe doing exactly the same thing, exactly the same type of injury, excuse me. But they may not get the same recognition. So I think in this context, that's what we're talking about. There's 300,000 people that were affected. There is concern about the Iran war now, and might we have the same problem? And it seems like the consensus is that anyone that's injured in this conflict, as long as they're not physically in Iran, they're covered under the current framework. Now, if we do boots on the ground, that's going to be a different story. And however, and we may have boots on the ground right now. And it sounds, there are enough reports to suggest that maybe there might be. So, are those individuals going to be covered? Well, we don't know. And until our Congress creates something that is a more blanket coverage for individuals serving. In other words, do we really need Congress to get through congressional inertia to provide the service for these veterans that we all know what happened?
It seems there might be like some small nuance issue that Congress could address here, but interestingly enough, you have a bunch of different states that are looking at resolutions to encourage Congress to act on this. I mean, we're talking North Dakota, Mississippi, Iowa over the past year. Here's just a sampling of some of those state houses.
It be resolved by the House of Representatives of North Dakota and the Senate concurring therein that the 69th Legislative Assembly urges Congress to issue an Armed Forces Expeditionary Medal or similar recognition of having served in the area of hostility to the United States troops who served in Honduras, from 1981 to 1992.
Mr. Chairman, I have House Resolution number 37. This is from Military Affairs. It memorializes Congress to issue the Armed Forces Expeditionary Medal to all United States veterans who served in Honduras from 1981 to 1992. This was the Central America uprising, the Nicaragua and et cetera, the Contras and the Sandinistas, and there were hundreds of thousands of American military that were there, some who lost their lives. Others were there in a expeditionary status, and we just want to honor them through this resolution.
That's just Louisiana and North Dakota, but you've got Iowa, who also passed a resolution, and a slew of other states from Kansas to New Jersey to Rhode Island, South Carolina, and others introducing similar legislation. Is that enough? Can states do more to help these particular veterans out get access to some kind of benefits?
It's a great first step that the states are even willing to do this and to develop some kind of consensus. The reality is states have not as much sway over the federal government in comparison to their elected officials, U.S. representatives, U.S. senators, and that's the pathway to really encourage reform, in a direct way on the respective committees. So the House Committee on Veterans Affairs, Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs. That's the first path. But this other alternative, which is putting pressure on the federal government through the state houses, I think has a lot of. It's an interesting direction, and I think it's something that should be supported and really develop. Again, I mentioned, I think, inertia before. That type of pressure maybe just makes the agency itself and the current administration think about coming up with solutions and maybe going to Congress to come up with a way to bridge the gap for these individuals that were affected. By more states coming forward, I think the reason states should consider it is that we have a homeless veteran problem, and we have a veteran suicide problem. And these are known issues. We've been pouring tens of millions, hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars into these solutions. By encouraging the federal government to recognize the full effect of our activities overseas in conflicts, including Honduras, and there are probably other theaters that aren't presently recognized as well, by encouraging Congress to take action in this way and the agencies to take action in this way, it's not only going to be serving veterans in the future, but also helping get supports through VA pension if the veteran doesn't have a current service-connected disability and or income to a certain level. Maybe pension is the solution that may help them get through and not be homeless, not have some of these challenges, and potentially open the door to get certain healthcare benefits that may only be there for official combat veterans. And by getting that recognition, maybe they're going to be able to get access in those states and be less of a burden on the state and have the federal government really pay the full cost of war. Because at the end of the day, what this is about is the government not fully protecting and serving individuals that served and not fulfilling that promise simply because of a little bit of bureaucratic red tape.
Benjamin Krause, founder of disabledveterans.org, greatly appreciate your time. Very enlightening, no question, and maybe that can get some people thinking about what the next steps are. And we'll be covering that more here with the states. We'll be right back. Mexican-based human smuggling rings have been busted in multiple states across the country. The Center Square contributor Bethany Blankley reports one involved smuggling hundreds of people from Central America, Africa, and the Middle East into Arizona. Another involved holding hostage foreign nationals in a ransom scheme where they were killed. Another involved a $200 million forced labor scheme on U.S. farms. In one case you can read about at thecentersquare.com, in September 2024, a suspect personally collected $15,000 in ransom payments from the U.S. citizen wife of the father of 4 who had been held against his will in Mexico by a smuggling organization, and transported and delivered the money to conspirators in Mexico. After ransom demands were met, more demands were made. Once the family couldn't pay anymore, communication was cut off, and the man is believed to have been killed, according to federal complaints. In Arizona, the latest of 2 Mexican nationals involved in transnational human smuggling rings, extradited to the Mexico government, was sentenced to 87 months in prison. The scheme involved smuggling foreign nationals from Central Asia, Africa, and the Middle East into the U.S. between 2018 and 2022, charging each as much as $10,000. In Georgia, 3 people were sentenced to between 10 and 51 months in prison for their roles in a human smuggling and labor trafficking operation that involved illegally transporting foreign nationals to work on South Georgian farms as agricultural workers. Now, that scheme dates back to 2015 and involved conspirators engaging in mail fraud, international forced labor trafficking, and money laundering, among other crimes, and fraudulently using the H-2A work visa program to transport foreign nationals from Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras into the U.S. under the guise of agricultural work, according to the charges. In another case in Florida, North Carolina, Virginia, 3 Mexican nationals, they were charged on 35 counts of trafficking Mexican farm workers into forced labor conditions and detaining them after their visas expired for financial gain. In another case, 6 people in Washington state were indicted on 61 charges of operating a similar scheme, also abusing the H-2A visa program. Now, you can read that entire story with even more examples at thecentersquare.com. The issue of immigration enforcement continues to be a focus of policymakers at the state house level all across the country, and some are taking different approaches altogether. In California, legislators this week discussed State Senator Sasha Perez's measure to inspect holding centers for immigration enforcement.
These facilities house thousands of people who depend on them for shelter, food, medical care, and basic safety. Because individuals in these settings cannot freely leave, the state has a responsibility to ensure that conditions are safe, humane, and consistent with basic health and safety standards. Yet, across this country, inside private immigration detention centers, people are being denied their basic rights. The California Attorney General recently released the Department of Justice's 5th report and found conditions in these facilities to be cruel, inhumane, and unacceptable, citing issues such as undercooked food, limited access to clean drinking water, inadequate and delayed medical care, and 6 deaths in less than a year. The consequences are devastating. Last year alone, 32 people died in ICE custody, the deadliest year in decades.
As legislators continue with that measure in California, you've also got ongoing litigation and court battles over the issue of cooperating between local law enforcement and federal immigration enforcement in states like California and Illinois, or other so-called migrant sanctuary jurisdictions. Now, in Nevada, during a state house discussion on when people are released from jails for various crimes, Clark County Detention Center Deputy Chief Sherry Page, she discussed how they cooperate with immigration officials when somebody is set to be released.
When an inmate is booked on a felony or a Laken-Riley Act charge and is born foreign, we do notify ICE. ICE may choose to notify us, and if they do and they are interested, the person, they will send us either an I-200 or I-205 form, which the I-205 form is that a guarantee that detainer that they are going to pick up the individual, and the I-200 form is notification that they will possibly be picking up the individual. Either way, our warrant officer gives that form to the individual. They're responsible for notifying and giving that form to the individuals, or serving the warrant to the inmate. We then, if the inmate signs that, No. So we serve the form, and then the inmate is held up to 48 hours past their release from custody to give ICE that opportunity to come get them. If ICE chooses not to act upon the warrant and come get them, then they are either released back into the community or released to a program or pending EMP or whatever that release for the charges states.
So again, showing how Arizona officials locally are working with immigration officials nationally, going after immigration violations, and how those who are being held in jails are handled in Arizona. Such efforts are being prohibited by state laws like in Illinois and elsewhere. But in Arizona, legislators, they recently approved a measure providing more enforcement over commercial driver's licenses. Arizona State Senator Catherine Miranda, she criticized the move, saying it's redundant.
Yes, the only difference in this bill from the last time I heard it in committee is now law enforcement groups are against it. Arizona Police Associations and Arizona Sheriff's Association is against this bill. I just want to remind everyone that Arizona and federal law already prohibit an undocumented person from receiving a CDL. SB 1511 implements redundant law that the state already follows. Again, these requirements outlined in the bill are already prescribed by federal rules, making this bill duplicative and unnecessary. I also want to share my concern that this bill would subject commercial vehicle drivers to unnecessary stops by law enforcement to comply with this proposal. How would law enforcement know when to pull someone over to check their legal status? I've said it before and I'll say it again. This proposal is not about public safety. It's about furthering anti-immigrant sentiments, and I vote no.
Expect more debates on those issues all across the country, and we'll highlight those here with the states. We'll be right back. State financial aid continuing to expand within higher education all across the country, allowing money to go to eligible illegal immigrant students. Increased spending is heating up debate all over the place on whether or not such individuals should receive taxpayer-funded higher education benefits. Joining us to discuss what both sides of this issue are saying is the Center Square education reporter, Esther Wickham. Esther, thanks for taking time with us. It's always good to see you. You reported that currently there's around 21 states and the District of Columbia offering in-state tuition eligibility to certain immigrant students. Talk a bit about this and where else this is playing out across the country.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks, Greg, for having me. This definitely is a continuing heated debate around the country as more and more states offer in-state eligibility for tuition for illegal immigrant students, as well as state financial aid programs. So currently, according to the Federation for American Immigration Reform, a report came out in 2025 that nationally it's about $5.7 billion in taxpayer funding that's costing taxpayers for state financial aid programs, and the difference these illegal immigrant students are receiving when they get in-state tuition compared to U.S. citizens and American students applying for colleges and universities that they wish to go to. When it comes to the in-state tuition, if they live out of state, they have to pay the base tuition. And so according to higher ed immigration, like you said, 21 states, including DC, are offering in-state tuition eligibility for certain immigrant students. And currently there are 18 states, along with DC, that provide access to state financial aid programs. And we'll get into a little bit later what exactly those look like. But more and more states are implementing the DREAM Act, RISE Act, Promise scholarships that specifically allow illegal immigrant students to, apply, have certain eligibility requirements, and the main requirement is that they only have 3 years of high school status.
What are critics saying about this, other than just the $5 billion cost to taxpayers all across the country?
Yeah. So one of the main arguments that we're seeing is the eligibility requirement. Now, a lot of these states, the main requirement, like I said, is the 3 years in high school, but it's also the main recipients that we're seeing are DACA students, so Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, which is essentially providing temporary protection for deportation and renewable work permits to certain immigrants who were brought to the United States as children. So there are currently over 900,000 of these individuals eligible for DACA. And right now, there's over 500,000 illegal immigrant students that are enrolled in colleges and universities. And so I spoke with a few education experts who are kind of critics of these state financial aid programs, specifically Ira Melman. He's the media director for FAIR, the Federation for American Immigration Reform. And they've provided a lot of different reports on how much these programs are actually costing taxpayers and the difference between U.S. citizens and illegal immigrant students that are actually partaking in these immigration programs.
Esther, you report a bit about what's going on in Texas. You've got significant costs, but also some litigation that's happened there. Highlight that from your story.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, the DREAM Act is the main point of controversy. And something that Ira Melman kind of highlights is Texas was this main state that pioneered this kind of loophole that we see in the 1996 Immigration Reform Act, which essentially says that when you provide in-state tuition to, as he says, illegal aliens, you also have to have it available for U.S. citizens. And so he says that in the state of Texas in 2001, they created this loophole or provision that conditioned in-state tuition if you have only completed 3 years of high school in the state. And so currently, the Trump administration has taken many steps to combat that provision, that law. And so in June of last year, we saw the U.S. Department of Justice sue the state of Texas, saying that you are actually violating federal law and citing the supremacy clause, that federal law says that any kind of state programs or state tuition should be eligible for all citizens, for all American students. And Texas isn't necessarily doing that. And so we're seeing a lot of these advocacy groups intervening and saying, the case has to be resolved and it can't be without sufficient judicial review, and that these students should be eligible to have the opportunity to go to school and receive state aid.
There are so many different facets to this, Esther. One question I definitely want to touch on here is, cui bono, who benefits? Because this is not just happening in Texas, this is happening in other states. But before we get to that question of, who benefits, obviously these certain students either in the country illegally or who might have certain types of protective status. There's a lot of, different types of definitions underneath that umbrella of non-citizen. But how does this impact the student loan debate and the amount of debt that there is right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I spoke with Lance Azumi. He is one of the education experts for Pacific Research Institute. And, they're mainly based in California. So he had a lot to say for the state of California, since it is a huge blue state that contributes a lot of funding, not only in education, but other sectors for illegal immigrants. And a main thing he had to say is the fairness aspect. What about these taxpayer-funded programs are going to illegal immigrants at the cost of other American citizens? He highlights every single time a legal immigrant student is getting into these colleges, that takes a seat away from a hard-working taxpayer family for a student that wanted to go to those schools. So not only is it just the cost, but also the opportunity. And so we're seeing this student loan increase. And I think, Greg, that's not only this issue. It's just education in general around grants and scholarship programs. I think nowadays a lot of students are kind of wary or unsure how to go about the cost, the daunting cost of education, as we're seeing it increase year after year. And there are a lot of grants and scholarship opportunities out there, but unfortunately, it's just not readily available, or education is not really around it to figure out what's available for them. So the cop out, the easy thing to do is just, get a student loan and worry about it 10, 20, 30 years down the road. And so I think that's a big issue we're seeing is this opportunity kind of being taken away. And some people that support these programs had, opposition in response to say it against that.
Well, and I do want to hear a little bit of what you found supporters of these policies are saying, but regardless if it's a citizen or a non-citizen that gets a student loan, that's obviously adding to, the issue of debt concerns and financial management and whatnot. But somebody's getting that money, Esther. Back to that Q Bono question, who benefits? I bet the schools in these various states are saying, hey, they're seeing some money come in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and like I said, when it comes to the in-state tuition, ultimately who benefits are these illegal immigrant students, because they're getting kind of a deducted amount spending for the college. For example, in the UC system, it's approximate, it's rough, but in-state tuition costs around $15,000 annually for in-state tuition, where the base tuition for a UC school is around $31,000. And so those that live in California, for example, and those DACA students, those illegal immigrant students that are applying for the DREAM Act or other programs like it in California, get that in-state tuition base, and they're essentially, saving themselves $16,000. But when you provide more programs like that and you get more students, it does ultimately benefit the schools at the taxpayer expense.
Well, Esther, plenty more to report out about that and many more things happening on the education space, including the latest on what's happening at the U.S. Department of Education. But we're going to have to save this story that people can find at thecentersquare.com under the Education tab, where you can find other issues our reporters, including Esther, are working diligently to address. You can find those stories at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the States. I'm Greg Bishop. Earlier this year, for the Everyday Economics podcast, Center Square publisher Chris Krug and PhD economist Orphe Devungi, they discussed the barriers that remain in today's economy for Black families looking to buy a home.
You're saying that Black applicants are denied at higher rates than white applicants in all 50 of the largest U.S. metros. The counterintuitive finding in that is that the widest Black-white denial gaps are not in the most expensive housing markets. So it's not really a city issue, or I think a lot of Americans would think about it as cities, but actually happening in places where there's a lower cost of living, smaller markets. So let's start at the foundation on this. When a bank turns someone down for a mortgage, that gets reported in a federal data set, this Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data. In plain terms, what is a denial gap, and what do the numbers show when you lined up Black and white applicants across the biggest metros? Let's start with the biggest metros first.
Totally. Well, the denial, so what the study does is it looks at the denial rates, right? And the gap, for first, Black applicants are more likely to be denied a mortgage than other applicants, but in this case, we look at white applicants. And that gap is true across the country. Now, the big question is why, right? Why is it that black applicants versus white applicants would be more likely to be denied, a mortgage. And what does the data show? Well, the data show that before we go into the regional differences, I think the first thing is that, higher debt to income ratios are a problem, right? When you show up to apply for a mortgage, your credit score matters, your debt to income ratio matters, the cost of that house that you're buying, right? So the size of the loan is going to matter, right? And so those are factors that go into the application. And what you learn very quickly is that, the thing that matters the most, right, for the gap between, the acceptance rate, basically, is the fact that, in places where you have in places where, you have bigger gaps in terms of financial readiness, right? In terms of having lower debt to income ratios, in terms of credit scores, and all of those factors I just mentioned, you're going to have wider gaps. It's very intuitive. If you have a big population, two different populations, and one group, they're very similar on all characteristics except race, but one group has higher incomes, lower debt, lower credit scores, they're less likely to be denied than the other group, right? And so that is what this study shows. And what I alluded to, counter to intuitive finding, it's a lot of people would have thought, well, maybe it's more true in markets that are more expensive.
Yeah.
It happens to be more true in markets that are less expensive, lower income markets, actually, where people are actually more stretched financially.
Yeah. But whenever you talk about, I think this subject, in the broadest term, right? The arrow points back to, the redlining that was brought upon by FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, way back when, in that era, and that's not what this is, right? I mean, this is about qualification. It's about income, and about credit scores, right? I mean, but why is it that Black Americans in smaller metro markets are having such a difficult time? Is it about opportunity? Is it about job qualifications? Is it about, what's the heart here? Because it's not, it's not about racism, right? It's about the numbers.
Well, look, it is about the numbers, but here's the thing that is, of course, you mentioned redlining. I think it's important to mention redlining. You can't deny, basically.
I don't think we can have this conversation without talking about redlining, right?
Of course. And we cannot deny the long-term impact of redlining. Sure. The fact that basically today, especially today, when housing has gotten so expensive, a lot of people get their down payment from what I would call the bank of mom and dad.
Yes,
right?
You'd love to refer to the bank of mom and dad, and right. As a mom and dad who's become, not yet become a bank, but potentially could be a bank. I love that line.
That's right. And so part of the problem with redlining is that for generations and generations, fewer Black families had access to home ownership, and we know that a lot of times, the bank of mom and dad, the funds that come from the bank of mom and dad, come from the equity that they've accumulated as homeowners over the years. And so with fewer parents having access to home ownership, Black kids today don't necessarily have access to that equity that they can use to buy their own homes. And so we can't sweep redlining under the rug, because it still plays a role today. Right now, of course, this study doesn't dig into that. It says, look, the effect of redlining has persisted, continues to persist. But then, you show up, of course, at the mortgage lender's office, and it's already kind of too late. I think Black families have to work harder, much harder, to overcome the fact that they don't have access to the bank of mom and dad, right? Yeah. and to get their financial situation in order, right?
As soon as possible, and be conscious about it, right?
Because of what you mentioned, because of redlining, it just takes them longer to be financially ready, to have accumulated the savings for that down payment, right? In order to go ahead and to have that clean bill of health, financial health, in order to go ahead and apply for a loan, right? And get approved for a mortgage. So all of those factors are at play here. Of course, this report focuses on the financial file at the time of the application. Right. And when you look at the financial file at the time of the application, you see this gap, right? Yes. And this gap is bigger in lower income markets, less expensive markets, where families are likely more financially stretched in the first place. And that's why you see these gaps are much larger in those smaller markets where incomes are a little bit lower, where people might be carrying higher debt to income ratios.
I always enjoy these conversations, and I think that that's maybe the clearest explanation that I've heard on this disparity yet. So thanks for everything, Dr. O. I really appreciate it. Make sure you read Orphe's Everyday Economics column every Monday at the Center Square and listen to what we have to say each weekend on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Welcome back to the States. Now it's time for America's Talking, with headlines from across the country you can find in the description below or in your inbox at thecentersquare.com. Free, again, at thecentersquare.com. Protesters outside churches, synagogues, and other religious places of worship will have to keep a certain distance from places of worship in California. That's after legislation is advancing, where the Center Square California reporter Madeline Shannon reporting this measure from Assemblymember Rebecca Bauer-Kahan. It would require protesters to stay at least 100 feet away from an entrance or exit for a religious facility. Here's the sponsor of that legislation laying out some of their concerns.
This is a bill that is a priority of the Legislative Jewish Caucus because, frankly, this is our lives every day when we show up to worship in our synagogues. When I drop my kids off at Sunday school, I drive through a gate that I have to have a clicker for. On the other side is an armed guard. And my kids' doors have been replaced in case an active shooter comes in. This is what it means to worship in a synagogue in 2026. This should feel, and when I was growing up, my synagogue was my second home. It was one of the places I felt most safe. And yet today we live in a world that is divided, full of hate, not just of the Jewish community. I'm just speaking of my own lived experience, where houses of worship no longer feel as safe as they should. And we have seen here in California that people who are entering their synagogues or mosques, churches, other places of worship, as they enter, they are surrounded, they are yelled at, they're often trying to enter to pray, to pick up their kids at Sunday school or preschool or whatever is happening inside the facility.
Now, also at that hearing, opponents, they testified that the public ways like sidewalks where protesters often gather, they're assembling outside a place of worship protected by the U.S. Constitution to be able to protest. And other news from across the country, an interesting story out of Ohio where a mother, Central Ohio mother, apparently reported her son's activity to local police, leading to a breakup of a terror plot to create chaos at Sunday's UFC fight on the White House lawn. It's according to multiple reports. The Center Square regional editor J.D. Davidson reporting a federal affidavit said Tyson Proper was arrested Wednesday after his mom called the Danville Police Department and the Knox County Sheriff's Office, raising concerns about her son's recent conduct. including firearm purchases and communications with certain individuals online. The mother telling law enforcement that her son recently used $3,000 from his graduation money to buy camping gear, food, ballistic plates, a new shotgun, a rifle, lots of ammunition, and extra magazines. And that was all part of a plot the FBI says that they uncovered after discovering it last week. The plot involved using drones to attack the UFC fight on the White House lawn. Now, Chicago faces an ongoing lawsuit over a tax ordinance on social media platforms that was imposed 4 months ago, but city officials said this week they have confidence in its legality. That measure also already bringing in substantial revenue. Here's Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson talking about the above expected revenues and the tune of $49.2 million it could bring in, rather than previously estimated at $31 million.
By making sure that we pass innovating, progressive revenue streams like the first of its kind, the social media amusement responsibility tax, or the SMART tax. We can fund critical services like our mental health clinics and our crisis response teams. We're seeing what's possible when we challenge these big tech corporations to pay their fair share.
Now, the tax is imposed according to statute on social media platforms with more than 100,000 users at a rate of 50 cents per user after the minimum threshold. The Center Square reporter Sean Reed reports millions of dollars in revenue has yet to be counted towards the city's budget. The state's reason for not being counted is because of ongoing litigation, according to city officials. Now, similar policy passing through the Illinois General Assembly back in May, seeking to tax the platforms statewide. Governor J.B. Pritzker defended that measure, saying that he's not basing any revenues in the budget off of that new fee as this continues to work through the courts, but he says he's confident they'll be able to collect those taxes.
I don't know if I would use the word conservative, but I would say prudent. I have been over the many years about not counting revenue that we don't know that we're going to get. And you may have noticed that, as it turns out, we've had more revenue in most years than we have expected, in part because we've tried to make sure that we're not overestimating. So I don't want anybody to think that we're just making numbers up from here and there. We, in fact, didn't include, as you pointed out, on things like the digital ad tax and things like that, because we're a little unsure about what could result from there. We feel much more confident about the social media platform fee.
Now, NetChoice, a trade group representing industry giants like Meta and X, they filed a lawsuit against Chicago in March on the grounds the city isn't allowed to place an amusement tax on the companies. A representative for the group telling the Center Square that the group may also sue the state over other legislation, which has to do with safety of children online. And that's just some of what America is talking about. Get these and other headlines below or at thecentersquare.com. From my studios in Central Illinois, I'm Greg Bishop, and join us back here Thursday for more stories impacting you, the taxpayer, from across the country, only with the states, powered by the Center Square.